A trembling King Charles fights back tears as he confesses, "My son is gone, and I don't know if he'll ever come back." In a moment that stunned the nation, King Charles has broken decades of royal silence to reveal the unthinkable. Prince Harry has vanished without a trace. Just weeks before his disappearance, Harry quietly requested a DNA test, questioning the truth of his own bloodline and reopening dark rumors about James Hewitt. Why did he do it? What did he discover? And why did he vanish right after? Stay with us as we uncover the private confrontation that shattered the monarchy, the trail of clues leading to Harry's final days, and the hidden story no one at the palace ever wanted the world to know. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Under a somber gray sky that blanketed Buckingham Palace, the British monarchy faced a storm more profound than any in recent memory. This wasn't political backlash. This wasn't a royal scandal rooted in protocol missteps or PR blunders. This was personal. It was raw. It was human. And for King Charles III, it was unbearable. The day had begun like any other for royal watchers, a quiet morning with little indication that a seismic shift was about to crack through the serene walls of royal tradition. But at exactly 10:43 a.m. London time, the Royal Press Office issued a one-sentence statement that rocked the United Kingdom and sent shockwaves far beyond its borders. His Majesty the King will address the nation in an emergency broadcast regarding the personal matter of his youngest son, Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex. The air grew heavier with speculation. In an era where headlines were often dictated by trivial palace antics or Meghan Markle's next media move, this was different. It wasn't a scheduled public appearance. It wasn't related to climate initiatives or Commonwealth duties. It wasn't ceremonial. It was desperate. When the royal seal flickered onto television screens, there was a collective inhale across households, pubs, and institutions. King Charles III appeared alone. No aides, no lectern, no gilded throne. Just a father. His eyes were rimmed with red. His voice cracked with fatigue. The backdrop was simple, stripped of grandeur, a deliberate move that foreshadowed the gravity of what he was about to reveal. And then, he began to speak. "My fellow citizens," he started slowly, each word heavy and deliberate. "As a father, not as your king, I stand before you today heartbroken and uncertain. My son, my beloved son, Harry, has disappeared." There was no ceremony in his tone, no royal phrasing to soften the blow. It was blunt. It was devastating. The airwaves carried silence as viewers stared, stunned. For the first time in British history, a reigning monarch wasn't addressing war, law, or national mourning, but rather the anguish of a missing son. And the words that followed turned confusion into emotional chaos. "Just weeks before his disappearance, Harry came to me in private," Charles continued, his voice cracking. "He asked for something no father wants to hear. He requested a DNA test on himself." Those words detonated centuries of royal decorum. In one stroke, Charles didn't just acknowledge that something had gone terribly wrong in his family. He reopened a vault of speculation that had been whispered about for decades but never officially addressed. The paternity rumors surrounding Prince Harry and the man long suspected by tabloids to be his real father, Major James Hewitt. The silence that followed King Charles's announcement was deafening. Not in the literal sense, London traffic still rumbled, birds still called, but in the psychological vacuum it created. People didn't know what to say, how to react. Newsrooms scrambled, social media exploded, and royal experts were left grasping at fragments of their previous narratives. Had Harry truly believed the rumors? Had he finally reached a breaking point that forced him to seek out a truth he could no longer ignore? The king's revelation was just the beginning. As the camera zoomed in, Charles's emotional state became increasingly clear. His jaw trembled, his brow furrowed not in anger, but in something far more vulnerable: grief. "Regret." He said to me, "I need to know the truth, even if it destroys everything," Charles shared, repeating his son's chilling words. Even the harshest critics of the monarchy struggled to find judgment in that moment. This wasn't about palace prestige. This wasn't about public image. This was about a father who had just realized that his son had lived in silent torment for most of his adult life, and maybe longer. To understand the full weight of the moment, we must rewind. The rumors about Prince Harry's parentage began in the mid-1990s when tabloids began drawing visual comparisons between Harry and James Hewitt, a former British Army officer with whom Princess Diana had admitted to having a relationship. For years, the royal family dismissed these whispers as speculative tabloid trash. Charles never acknowledged them publicly. Harry, too, Never responded, at least, not until now. And now, not only had he acknowledged them privately, he had vanished soon after. The introduction of the DNA test request introduced a twist so psychologically devastating that even fiction writers couldn't have pinned it more dramatically. It wasn't merely about biological truth. It was about identity, belonging, betrayal, and the search for origin, a theme that plagues the lives of millions. But when played out on the royal stage, it gains amplified resonance. And the questions mounted rapidly: what had driven Harry to this breaking point? Was it a conversation with Meghan? An unburied letter from his late mother? A revelation from a trusted friend or royal aide? What, exactly, had led him to believe the man he'd called Pa his entire life might not actually be his father? For Charles, the personal devastation was layered. Publicly, he had long played the part of the dignified monarch. Privately, he had tried to maintain the role of a reconciliatory father amid the endless rifts that had plagued his family. But nothing could have prepared him for a son disappearing into silence, physically and emotionally, after seeking proof of their bloodline connection. The palace, so often criticized for its cold efficiency and calculated responses, was now paralyzed. For once, there was no script. There were no advisors standing off camera. The king's words were unfiltered and uncoached. "I do not know where my son is," he admitted toward the end of his address, tears brimming in his eyes. "But if you can hear this, Harry, come home. Whatever you found, whatever you feared, come home. You are my son." It was a moment that stopped the nation, and it was only the beginning. In the hours following the broadcast, news outlets entered overdrive. Helicopters swarmed areas near known Sussex residences. Paparazzi flooded Los Angeles streets. Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok became hotbeds for unverified footage claiming to have spotted Harry at airports, hospitals, or even monasteries. Meanwhile, the royal family entered lockdown mode, retreating from public engagements and issuing a strict no-comment order across all departments. But the damage was done. Pandora's box had been opened. A British monarch had just admitted, before the entire world, that not only was his son missing, but that his son may have been motivated by doubts over his own paternity. It was historic. It was haunting. And it was real. This wasn't the kind of story the palace could spin away. This wasn't a misstep by a distant royal cousin or a misquoted statement from a minor aide. This was the heir to the throne sobbing over his son. This was the monarchy at its most exposed and fragile. And for the first time in a long time, the people saw them, not as royals, but as a deeply wounded family torn apart by secrets. As the king's broadcast ended, one last image lingered: Charles lowering his eyes, lips trembling, as he whispered the words, "Please forgive me." The screen faded to black, and the world held its breath. That was the moment everything changed. The stillness after the king's broadcast was more than a pause in the news cycle. It was the kind of silence that sits heavy on the chest, the kind that tells you something irreversible has occurred. And at the center of that silence stood a man who had spent his entire life preparing for a throne, yet in that moment, found himself utterly powerless. King Charles III, a figure long criticized for emotional restraint, now stood naked before the world, not as a monarch issuing decrees, but as a father, visibly wrecked by grief, regret, and confusion. This section begins not in the palace, but in the hollowed heart of a man who just realized that the one thing he could not protect was his own son's soul. Charles had lived his life under scrutiny. From the moment of his birth, he was trained to shoulder responsibility, to present composure, to carry the crown with poise. Emotion, especially in the Windsor bloodline, was often dressed in the language of duty. But what happens when duty and emotion collide head-on? What happens when the very institution you were born to lead becomes the source of your deepest personal anguish? That was the emotional cliff Charles now stood upon. Sources close to the palace reported that Charles hadn't slept in nearly 72 hours before making the public address. His aides, even those most loyal to maintaining royal protocol, noticed the shift. He was disheveled, slow to respond, pausing in the middle of meetings to stare into empty spaces. When one aide nervously asked if he needed a rest, Charles allegedly replied, "I can't rest if my son is out there thinking he's not mine." That sentence, simple, unfiltered, cut deeper than any official statement could. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't regal. It was human. It was the sound of a father losing control of his narrative. Charles had never spoken publicly about the rumors surrounding Harry's paternity. Not once. Not in the tabloids' heyday when speculation was at its peak. Not during interviews. Not even in back-channel briefings to journalists. To many, his silence had long seemed strategic. Royals do not dignify gossip. But the truth, as we now understand it, was far more complicated. According to palace insiders, Charles's silence wasn't strategy, it was pain. The rumors had haunted him since the early 1990s. Even after Diana's tragic death, when the media temporarily pulled back out of respect, whispers still found their way into headlines and comment sections. And while Charles publicly focused on his duties and engagements behind palace doors, those rumors lingered like a ghost he couldn't shake. To him, Harry wasn't a question mark. He was his son, the child he'd carried in his arms, taught how to fish, watched take his first wobbly steps. The boy whose laughter echoed through Balmoral corridors and whose mischief reminded him of Diana's rebellious spark. He didn't need a DNA test to know love. But now, the doubt had come from within, not from tabloids, not from rivals, but from Harry himself. That betrayal stung deeper than any public smear. It wasn't because Charles feared the test. It wasn't because he feared what it might reveal. It was because the very request meant that Harry had carried these doubts for years, maybe decades, and hadn't trusted his own father enough to talk about it until now. The conversation between father and son that reportedly took place in Clarence House weeks before Harry's disappearance was said to be short, tense, and utterly heartbreaking. Harry had flown in unannounced, with no formal entourage. The guards were stunned when they saw him standing at the gate. No security detail, no cameras. He simply said, "I need to speak to my father." Alone. The meeting lasted just under an hour. What exactly was said remains a tightly held secret, but multiple palace sources confirmed the central issue was the DNA test. One senior advisor, who spoke on condition of anonymity, said the conversation ended with Charles seated in silence as Harry stood to leave. He didn't say goodbye, the advisor shared. He just said, "I'll get the truth one way or another." That statement reverberated through the palace like an earthquake. Charles reportedly didn't attend any scheduled meetings for the next 2 days. He was seen walking the royal gardens alone, speaking to no one, occasionally looking up at the windows of rooms where Harry once slept as a boy. More than anything, Charles was consumed by one question. Why now? Why had Harry waited until now, after all the media noise had faded, after relocating to America, after becoming a father himself, to finally confront the paternity question? Some palace insiders believed the answer might lie with Harry's own children. Perhaps watching his son Archie grow sparked familiar doubts. Perhaps the fear that he might be unknowingly repeating his father's sins pushed him toward a truth he had long buried. Others believed the motivation was more immediate. Rumors began swirling that Harry had obtained previously sealed correspondence between Diana and an unnamed confidant in which she allegedly hinted at secrets she had kept from Charles, including doubts about their timeline of fidelity. If such a letter did exist, it might have been enough to reignite Harry's darkest suspicions. Whatever the trigger, the emotional toll it took on Charles was undeniable. In the days following the request, the king's public appearances became less frequent. Photos showed him visibly thinner, hands trembling slightly during official greetings. At one charity gala, he abruptly ended his speech halfway through, claiming exhaustion. Privately, however, aides knew the truth. He had broken down backstage, repeating the phrase, "He doesn't believe I'm his father," over and over until Camilla had to intervene. For Charles, who had spent much of his life living under the burden of being misunderstood, this felt like a final indictment. If even his own son questioned the bond between them, what did that say about his worth not as king, but as a man? In moments of vulnerability, those close to him say he confessed fears that Harry's doubts stemmed from his failings as a father. Was it the divorce? Was it the coldness that the palace enforced in raising young boys? Was it the royal system itself, a structure that prized protocol over hugs, duty over intimacy? In the quiet of his private chambers, Charles reportedly revisited home videos of Harry's childhood. One in particular, according to a royal archivist, seemed to haunt him. It was a video of Charles teaching Harry how to ride a bike in the gardens of Highgrove. Charles was laughing, truly laughing, as Harry struggled, fell, and then got up again. In the video, Harry looks up at his father and says, "Did you see that, Pa?" Charles whispers to the screen, "I saw everything, son. I saw everything." This was the grief that couldn't be televised. The kind of grief that builds not from one single act, but from the slow erosion of connection. And now, that connection had not only been frayed, it had vanished. Harry was gone. The DNA request wasn't the end of a long-held fear. It was the start of a rupture from which Charles feared they might never return. Still, beneath the heartbreak, there remained a flicker of anger. Not at Harry, but at himself. A man raised to rule, raised to serve, had somehow failed at the one job he never trained for, being a father in a family that desperately needed one. The tears he shed during the broadcast were not staged. According to the broadcast technician on duty that day, Charles insisted on no makeup, no retakes, and no cuts. "If I cry," he reportedly said, "they deserve to see that." And they did. Every tear, every pause, every quiver in his voice was real. And for the first time in his reign, and perhaps his life, the people didn't see Charles the monarch. They saw Charles the man. Charles the father. Charles the heartbroken. When the broadcast ended, Charles remained seated for over 5 minutes. Cameras were off. The room was silent. Finally, he looked at the producer and said, "Do you think he'll forgive me?" No one had an answer. This was the state of a man whose world had quietly unraveled. This was not a story about the institution of monarchy. This was about the institution of family, and how, sometimes, not even crowns and titles can protect against the most human of tragedies. Losing someone you love because you didn't see their pain until it was too late. And yet, the king's final words offered a thin thread of hope. "Whatever you found, whatever you feared, come home." Those were not the words of a man seeking to protect a legacy. They were the words of a father willing to let it all burn down if it meant having his son back. The disappearance of Prince Harry did not occur in a vacuum. It wasn't a single moment, a simple vanishing act that took place in the middle of the night without any warning signs. No, the unraveling had been slow and painful, drawn out over weeks that now, in hindsight, feel like carefully laid breadcrumbs. What makes this all the more chilling is the realization that the clues were there, if only someone had noticed them in time. This section aims to reconstruct the timeline of events leading to Prince Harry's disappearance. It's a timeline riddled with contradiction, secrecy, and the unspoken agony of a man at war with himself. The trail begins in the final week of April, during what the media had reported at the time as a private retreat for the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. What wasn't made public then was that Harry had flown alone to the UK just before that supposed getaway. On April 22nd, a private jet registered to an undisclosed American charter company landed at RAF Nordholt under a security clearance approved at the last minute by British authorities. The passenger manifest, later leaked, showed only one royal aboard, Prince Harry. No Meghan, no children, no aides, just Harry, reportedly carrying a single duffel bag and a folder filled with sealed documents. Security footage from the private terminal shows Harry wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, keeping his head low, avoiding eye contact with airport staff. Witnesses later recalled how agitated he seemed, pacing near the arrival bay for almost 10 minutes before entering a black SUV dispatched from Clarence House. There were no photographers, no royal motorcade. Everything had been arranged quietly, as though Harry didn't want anyone to know he had returned. That day, according to palace sources, Harry met privately with King Charles for the conversation that would later be confirmed in the king's emotional address, the DNA request. But what happened after that meeting is where the trail starts to grow murky. On April 24th, Harry was spotted briefly in a quiet corner of Hyde Park, sitting alone on a bench near the Serpentine. A jogger who passed him said he looked completely hollowed out, describing him as unshaven, restless, and visibly distressed. He reportedly spent over an hour in that spot, occasionally scribbling in a notebook, occasionally staring into space. When approached by a passerby who recognized him and asked if he was all right, Harry replied softly, "Just thinking." That same night, he boarded a return flight to California, again without fanfare. He arrived at the Santa Barbara airport early morning on April 25th and was driven back to Montecito. Meghan Markle was photographed later that day running errands, but between April 26th and May 3rd, public sightings of Harry dwindled to zero. Meghan was seen at events, photographed alone. Reporters began speculating about his absence, but the Palace and Archewell Foundation remained silent. Meghan's team later claimed Harry was taking personal time for family reflection, a statement so vague it only fueled further speculation. But behind the scenes, close friends of Harry say he was spiraling. According to one source who spoke on the condition of anonymity, Harry had confided in a former army friend during a phone call on April 28th. During that conversation, Harry reportedly sounded out of breath, paranoid, and rambling. He kept repeating the phrase, "What if everything I thought I knew was wrong?" That phrase would later be found underlined 3 times in a page of handwritten notes discovered in Harry's Montecito office. The notes, now part of a confidential investigation, were described by one staff member as a deeply disturbing window into his mental and emotional state. On May 1st, 2 major developments occurred that, in retrospect, appear to have been pivotal. The first was a call Harry placed to a private investigative lab in Switzerland, which reportedly handles high-profile DNA tests with complete anonymity. The lab has refused to comment on whether Harry submitted any samples or received any results. However, airline records show that a courier connected to the Sussex household sent an international package to Geneva on April 29, 2 days after his return from London. The second development was even more troubling. On the evening of May 1st, Harry attempted to contact King Charles again via a secure palace line. The call was answered, but the two reportedly did not speak. One palace aide claims Charles was emotionally overwhelmed and unable to take the call. Another claims Harry didn't leave a message, just silence, and then he hung up. From that point onward, everything began to unravel quickly. On May 3rd, neighbors in Montecito reported hearing raised voices from the Sussex residents. One source described the sounds as an argument, not violent, but emotional crying, yelling, doors opening and closing. Security personnel declined to comment when questioned by local police, who were called to the area due to noise complaints. No arrests were made, but it was the last confirmed incident involving Harry's presence. Then, on May 4th, Harry missed a scheduled video conference with his Archwell team. This was unusual. Harry was known for being punctual, especially on days involving team check-ins. Meghan reportedly told staff he wasn't feeling well, but when they followed up hours later, she responded via her assistant that Harry needed space. On May 5th, Meghan attended a charity event alone. When asked where Harry was, she replied with a tight-lipped smile, "He's working through some things." That evening, she was seen returning home alone. The next confirmed clue came from a traffic camera on a secluded road near Big Sur, California. At 3:17 a.m. on May 6th, a black Range Rover matching the registration of Harry's personal vehicle was seen heading north, far from the Sussex home, toward a remote stretch of the California coast known for its rugged terrain and spiritual retreats. The driver was alone. Facial recognition was inconclusive due to darkness, but investigators now believe it was Harry at the wheel. That was the last time he was seen. Since then, there have been dozens of alleged sightings: Harry at a gas station in Oregon, Harry at a diner in Montana, Harry at a desert motel in Arizona. None have been verified. Authorities have scoured cell tower data, credit card usage, and security footage from remote regions, but no definitive leads have emerged. What's chilling is how meticulously Harry appears to have covered his tracks. Investigators believe he disabled his mobile phone, abandoned digital communications, and may have even disposed of electronic devices entirely. Former royal security officers say such a clean disappearance is difficult to pull off, but not impossible for someone with access to the kind of high-level survival training Harry would have received during his time in the military. Still, the question remains, why? Why would Prince Harry, who spent years speaking openly about mental health, about family, about truth and reconciliation, why would he vanish like this, leaving behind his children, his foundation, and his increasingly fragile relationship with his father? Some speculate that Harry feared the results of a DNA test he may have already received, that he found the truth, and that truth shattered something so deep within him that he no longer felt he could live in the same world. Others believe the disappearance is a form of protest, a way to remove himself from a toxic ecosystem without confrontation. But perhaps the most compelling theory is also the simplest, that Harry wasn't running from the world, but from himself. That the identity he had been handed since birth had finally collapsed under the weight of decades-long speculation, and he simply needed to disappear to figure out who he really was. As of now, no ransom notes, no criminal evidence, and no foul play have been confirmed. The case remains officially classified as a voluntary adult disappearance. Yet few believe this is a typical missing persons case. This is a man with a global spotlight, a security detail, and access to the kind of resources most people could only imagine. If he wanted to be found, he would have been by now. The silence he left behind speaks louder than any statement. The last piece of confirmed information, the last documented footprint of Prince Harry, was a handwritten note found on his desk, dated May 2nd. It wasn't signed. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. But it read, "When you've lived your whole life in a story written by someone else, sometimes you have to disappear just to learn how to write your own. That single sentence may be the closest thing we have to an explanation. A prince, born into a fairy tale he didn't author, forced to play roles he didn't choose, finally choosing to vanish in order to rediscover who he truly is. This search continues. But for now, the timeline ends with a cliff. If there is one shadow that has hovered over Prince Harry since his teenage years, it is not the pressure of being a working royal, not the weight of his mother's tragic legacy, and not even the media scrutiny that hounded him from adolescence into adulthood. No, the shadow that never fully lifted was the persistent, haunting question of his paternity. A rumor so widespread, so deeply embedded in tabloid lore, that it became inseparable from his public identity. The theory that James Hewitt, not King Charles III, was his biological father. For most of his life, Prince Harry did what any child raised in the royal machine was expected to do: ignore, smile, pretend. Even when magazine covers juxtaposed side-by-side photos of a young Harry and a young James Hewitt, both sharing ginger hair, similar jawlines, and facial expressions that betrayed a certain eerie familiarity, Harry remained publicly silent. The palace, for its part, treated the rumor like it didn't exist. Royal aides waved it off as tabloid fiction, and even Diana, in her rare moments of candor, maintained that Harry had already been born by the time her affair with Hewitt began. But that wasn't enough for the public. The timeline of Harry's birth, September 15, 1984, came under frequent scrutiny, with skeptics arguing that the official narrative around Diana's relationship with Hewitt had been purposefully altered to protect the line of succession. These were not fringe conspiracy theorists. They were columnists, royal correspondents, and authors of best-selling biographies who, with winks and nods, kept the rumor alive even as years passed. So when King Charles confirmed that Harry had approached him for a DNA test, effectively acknowledging the rumor's validity by implication, it wasn't merely a personal tragedy. It was a cultural earthquake. It reopened a wound the monarchy had tried to scab over for decades. And it shifted the spotlight toward the one man who had long existed on the periphery of the royal world but now stood at its explosive center: James Hewitt. Major James Hewitt, a former British Army cavalry officer, had always maintained a certain level of tragic notoriety. His affair with Princess Diana became public in the mid-1990s, after the publication of Andrew Morton's bombshell biography and later Diana's own tell-all interview with Martin Bashir. Hewitt never denied the affair. In fact, he leaned into it, publishing his own memoir and making a string of media appearances that many critics viewed as exploitative and self-serving. At the time, Hewitt was portrayed in the press as a mixture of two personas: a foolish romantic and an opportunistic outsider. He was never truly accepted by royal circles, nor by the public. And yet, he became a household name largely because of the speculation surrounding Harry. For years, Hewitt has denied being Harry's father, repeating in interviews that the timeline of the affair makes the rumor biologically impossible. But even his denials were met with skepticism. Why? People asked. Did Harry bear so little resemblance to Charles compared to William? Why did Harry and Hewitt appear to have similar mannerisms, posture, and expressions? It didn't help that the palace never released any documentation to support the timeline it claimed. In an institution that controls so many facets of its narrative, the absence of transparency only deepened suspicion. So when Harry reportedly initiated a private DNA test outside the royal family's medical apparatus, it raised one essential question. Had he discovered something the public had only speculated about for years? According to investigative sources, Harry pursued the DNA test with surgical precision. He bypassed palace labs. He bypassed British institutions. The sample, reportedly his own blood and hair, was sent to a Swiss laboratory known for confidentiality. The lab, which has handled genetic tests for celebrities, international leaders, and even war criminals, would not confirm Harry's identity as their client. But multiple insiders say a high-profile test was received under the codename C. Redbridge. The timing of the test coincides almost perfectly with Harry's disappearance. Reports suggest the test was submitted in late April, with results likely returned by early May, just before Harry was last seen. So what could those results have revealed? Some royal commentators believe the results were inconclusive, that the lack of access to Charles's official DNA, guarded heavily by royal protocol, made a direct match impossible. Others argue that the results did not match known DNA markers of the Windsor lineage. A third theory, more extreme but gaining traction in online circles, posits that Harry's test was compared against James Hewitt's public genetic data, which, through ancestry databases and public records, has been partially leaked. If there was any match, even partial, the implications would be seismic. The line of succession is not merely ceremonial, it is legally binding. If Prince Harry were proven not to be the biological son of King Charles, it would retroactively raise questions about his titles, his security clearance, his inheritance, and his standing within the monarchy. It could also expose the royal family to unprecedented legal battles and constitutional crises, especially if evidence emerged that the truth had been known and covered up. But perhaps more important than the legal implications are the personal ones. For Harry, the DNA test was not an act of rebellion against the crown. It was a deeply human search for truth. He reportedly told a friend in confidence, "I just want to know who I am. That's it. Not for a book. Not for the cameras. Just for me." That statement, so simple yet so raw, is at the core of this chapter in Harry's life. The royal family often presents itself as a collection of public figures living in service of the nation. But for Harry, the DNA test was a rejection of that framework. It was a declaration that even princes deserve to understand their origins not as national symbols, but as people. And for King Charles, this moment was shattering in a different way. The public revelation of Harry's request forced him to confront not only the decades of rumors but the painful possibility that his son believed the worst of him, that he had lied, knowingly or unknowingly, for Harry's entire life. Royal insiders say that Charles was devastated not by the prospect that Harry might not be his biological son, but by the realization that their emotional distance over the years may have fed Harry's doubts. For a man whose own childhood was marked by absence and formality, the idea that he had failed to make his son feel secure was, reportedly, unbearable. Meanwhile, Meghan's role in this chapter remains clouded in ambiguity. Some reports suggest she opposed the DNA test, fearing the media firestorm it would ignite. Others say she supported Harry's decision but insisted the results remain private, regardless of the outcome. A more damning theory claims that she feared a potential match with James Hewitt would undermine the Sussex brand, a brand built, ironically, on their royal status. As for James Hewitt himself, he has remained silent since the King's televised address. His last known public sighting was at a cafe in Devon, where he was seen reading a newspaper just days before Harry's disappearance. When approached by a journalist, he offered no comment, simply shaking his head and walking away. His silence has done nothing to quell speculation. On the contrary, it has only intensified it. If Hewitt truly believes he is not Harry's father, many ask, why not issue a definitive public statement now? Why disappear into the background just as the world's attention is refocused on him? The answer may lie in the stakes. If Hewitt were to confirm a match, he would instantly become one of the most infamous figures in modern royal history. If he denied it, and was later proven wrong, his credibility would be shattered permanently. Silence, in this context, may be the only shield he has left. Regardless of the truth, the resurgence of the Hewitt rumor has reshaped the way people view Prince Harry, not as a prince with rebellion in his blood, but as a man desperately seeking clarity in a life full of contradiction. In the end, it's not just about DNA. It's about identity. It's about the emotional cost of uncertainty. About growing up under the constant gaze of a world that thinks it knows you, when you don't even know yourself. Harry's journey toward that truth, whether it led to revelation or devastation, was a private one. But the moment it intersected with public legacy, royal history, and generational trauma, it became a national crisis. And now, with Harry gone, that crisis has no resolution. Only questions. And silence. When the palace confirmed that Prince Harry had vanished, leaving behind no trace, no official statement, and no apparent destination, the world turned its eyes not only to King Charles but to the next in line to the throne, Prince William. As the older brother, the future monarch, and the only other person on earth who had walked a near-identical path through the labyrinth of royal life, William's reaction was both expected and unpredictable. The bond between the two brothers had always been complex, fluctuating between deeply affectionate and bitterly strained. Now, with Harry gone and their father in emotional shambles, the question emerged with brutal clarity. Was William grieving a brother or resenting a traitor? For much of the public, the image of William and Harry as inseparable was etched in memory. They were boys walking behind their mother's coffin in that agonizing funeral procession. They were teenagers supporting each other at Eton, cracking jokes during royal engagements, and serving together in the military. But that image began to fracture in recent years, particularly after Harry and Meghan's departure from the royal fold, an event now commonly referred to as Megxit. Behind closed doors, that split left deep emotional wounds. Royal insiders described their falling out as less about external politics and more about internal betrayal. William, raised to protect the institution above all else, reportedly saw Harry's exit in tell-all interviews as a direct attack, not just on the crown, but on their family. Harry, meanwhile, viewed William as complicit in a system that had hurt both of them, but which William continued to uphold without question. In the wake of Harry's disappearance, those tensions re-emerged with force. According to palace aides, William received the news late at night on May 6 via an encrypted call from a senior security official. Meghan had reportedly notified authorities earlier that evening when she realized Harry had not returned after several hours away and had not been reachable by phone. When the alert reached King Charles, it was William who was asked to handle the initial coordination with local authorities in California, given his prior military logistics training and familiarity with crisis response. Sources say William's initial reaction was cold, measured to the point of unsettling. He reportedly said, "He'll turn up. He always does." But within hours, as more information emerged, Harry's sudden withdrawal from engagements, the unreturned calls, the abandoned personal belongings, that confidence crumbled. He began making calls, quiet ones, to private investigators, to retired security personnel who had once guarded his brother, even, according to some reports, to former MI6 contacts. Still, William did not make a public statement. For days, he remained in the shadows, communicating only through intermediaries. Some saw this as evidence of emotional detachment. Others believed it was strategy, an attempt to keep the situation from spiraling into further media hysteria. Then, unexpectedly, William broke his silence. On May 11th, during a visit to a children's hospice in Cambridge, a reporter shouted a question across the press line. "Have you spoken to your brother, sir?" For a split second, William paused. Cameras captured the moment. His jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in raw hesitation. And then he said, "No, I haven't. And I'm worried." Those 5 words sent shockwaves across the country. It was the first time in over a year that William had spoken openly about his brother. And he didn't offer judgment. He didn't deflect. He admitted vulnerability. He admitted fear. The days that followed revealed a far more layered picture of William's reaction. Friends of the prince say he was privately devastated. One longtime friend told reporters, "He's angry, but he's not angry that Harry left. He's angry that Harry never came to him first. That Harry never said, 'I need you.'" This statement echoed sentiments that William had reportedly shared in the aftermath of Harry and Meghan's Oprah interview, that he felt blindsided, not by the content, but by the lack of communication beforehand. The same dynamic now seemed to be at play. Harry had disappeared not just from public view, but from William's life, without a word. There were also reports of guilt. William, according to some insiders, began combing through old messages, old photos, and even voicemails, looking for signs. One aide described him as obsessed with what he missed. He reportedly played back a voicemail Harry left him 2 months prior, one in which Harry simply said, "We should talk. Soon. Just us." William never returned the call. That oversight now tormented him. Yet, despite the grief and regret, William also reportedly wrestled with a quieter, darker question. What if Harry didn't want to be found? In private conversations, William began to express concern that Harry's disappearance wasn't just emotional, but intentional. "This wasn't a cry for help," he reportedly said. "This was a decision." That sentiment was not rooted in cynicism, but in painful familiarity. William had watched Harry struggle with depression, trauma, and identity for years. He had been the steady brother, the one expected to be reliable. But even he acknowledged that sometimes Harry's pain turned inward, silent and stubborn. William also found himself navigating palace politics amid personal crisis. As heir to the throne, he was expected to project stability while the monarchy faced its most emotional challenge in decades. With King Charles publicly weeping and palace operations in chaos, many royal duties fell silently to William's shoulders. Yet, he was also expected to lead the private search for his brother, a role that no amount of royal training could have prepared him for. One moment in particular crystallized the complexity of William's emotions. During a private meeting with his staff, one aide made a flippant remark about how Harry had always had a flair for drama. William, normally composed, reportedly snapped, "He's my brother. He's not a character in a show. Stop talking about him like he's a story." That outburst, though brief, revealed the depth of William's inner turmoil. He wasn't just managing a crisis, he was unraveling. And unlike the controlled environment of the monarchy, this crisis demanded a response that was deeply personal. In the days that followed, William quietly authorized private security teams to expand the search to several remote locations Harry had once mentioned during childhood, places like Balmoral, parts of Wales, and certain sites in Africa that Harry had visited during his charity work. He instructed the teams to work discreetly, outside the bounds of local law enforcement, with one instruction: find him. Quietly. The complexity of William's reaction is tied to a painful truth. He has always had to be the strong one, the controlled one, the one who stayed. Now, as the brother who left disappeared completely, William was left to question whether his own stoicism had created a gap too wide to bridge. And yet, despite the emotional chaos, William refused to surrender to bitterness. During a private lunch with a trusted family friend, he reportedly admitted, "If he's out there, and he's free from all this pain, maybe that's what he needed. I just want to know he's breathing." These were not the words of a prince or a future king. These were the words of a brother, exhausted, torn, and quietly broken. The public saw glimpses of that vulnerability when William and Kate attended a memorial service 2 weeks after Harry's disappearance. Observers noted William's distant gaze, his lack of interaction with guests, and the moment when he remained seated during a standing ovation. A breach of etiquette that some chalked up to distraction. But those who knew better understood. He was lost in thought, wondering where his brother was. In a deeply private moment, captured by none but the memory of an aide, William reportedly stood at the edge of the chapel after the service ended, staring at a single stained glass window that depicted 2 brothers in armor, side by side. He didn't say a word, but after several minutes, he whispered, almost to himself, "He was always the brave one." And that, perhaps, is the most poignant insight into William's state of mind. Despite years of public division, despite the betrayals both real and perceived, he still admired his brother. He still loved him. He still saw in Harry the courage to walk away when William felt forever tethered to duty. That admiration didn't lessen the pain. If anything, it deepened it, because William knew what so few others did. That Harry's decision to vanish wasn't just about the DNA test, the monarchy, or the media. It was about escape from a life neither of them chose. Now, as the world continues to search for answers, William waits. Not as a prince, not as the future king, but as a brother standing at the edge of a storm, hoping one day to see a familiar figure walking back through the fog. While the world consumed headlines, whispered theories, and watched a royal family unravel on live television, the epicenter of controlled chaos was behind the centuries-old stone walls of Buckingham Palace. Outside, cameras clicked and reporters barked questions into microphones. Inside, panic spread like a gas leak, slow, invisible, and deadly. For an institution designed to withstand global wars, divorces, scandals, and public rebellions, the disappearance of Prince Harry, paired with the king's devastating admission about the DNA request, created a breach so severe that no protocol, no advisor, and no heritage could contain it. The royal household operates on hierarchy, tradition, and discretion. Each department, press, security, royal engagements, family affairs, functions with precise rigidity. But as the sun rose the morning after King Charles's televised address, none of those departments knew what to do. The machinery had broken down. For the first time in decades, the monarchy was not under attack from the outside, it was bleeding from within. It began with whispers between senior advisors, aides, and private secretaries. Some could barely believe the king had gone public with Harry's DNA request. Others confessed privately that they'd known about the request days before and had pleaded with the king to keep it quiet. Their reasoning was clear. The monarchy could withstand public backlash, even personal scandal, but to validate the deepest, most persistent rumor about Prince Harry's paternity on national television was unprecedented. It wasn't just a revelation. It was an admission that the family's most sacred boundaries had been breached. But the king had overridden their advice. He had decided to speak directly, emotionally, and without institutional filters. And in doing so, he bypassed every layer of damage control that palace staff had relied on for decades. It wasn't just unexpected. It was dangerous. The panic began to spread. Within hours of the broadcast, the palace communications office was inundated with international media inquiries. Calls came in from CNN, the BBC, Reuters, Al Jazeera, and royal bureaus across Europe and Asia. Press secretaries were not prepared with talking points. There were no statements ready, no background briefings, and perhaps worst of all, no direction from the king. He's not to be disturbed, one senior aide reportedly told staff who sought guidance. That left the press office in a vacuum, where rumors grew faster than they could be contained. Was there a cover-up? Had someone inside the palace leaked the DNA story to Harry, prompting the request? Had the results already been received? Each question felt more impossible than the last. Meanwhile, inside the palace itself, staff were dealing with their own quiet chaos. The Royal Protection Unit, responsible for the safety of all senior royals, was working overtime, coordinating with Interpol, MI5, and the FBI to track Harry's movements. His last known location, traced through traffic surveillance footage and minimal phone metadata, was rapidly distributed among internal security circles. Every safe house, private estate, and royal-friendly retreat was flagged and investigated. Still nothing. As the hours turned into days, unease turned to suspicion. A classified internal report surfaced, outlining a suspected information breach within the palace. The report, according to multiple security sources, listed 3 potential leak sources: a disgruntled communications aide, a royal medical liaison with access to private files, and a mid-ranking security officer recently disciplined for procedural misconduct. Each had potential motive. Each had potential access. What the report didn't mention, but what many feared in hushed voices, was the possibility that the leak had come from someone higher up, someone trusted, someone with full knowledge of the DNA request, and perhaps more. By May 8th, barely 48 hours after Charles's broadcast, the palace initiated an internal audit of digital communications. Every senior aide's emails, texts, and secure lines were reviewed. Meetings were held in sealed rooms. Phones were locked outside. Trust deteriorated rapidly. Allies became suspects. The term containment replaced damage control. The Queen Consort, Camilla, was reportedly livid. Though she had not been consulted about the king's decision to speak publicly, she immediately understood the gravity of the fallout. Sources say she convened a private meeting of the inner circle, the dozen or so most powerful figures in the royal household, and demanded a unified front. Her tone was sharp. Her words, reportedly, even sharper. "This is not the time for finger-pointing," she allegedly said. "The family is bleeding. You either help bandage it or step aside." Behind that urgency was a deeper fear that the institution itself could crumble under the weight of unresolved secrets. The royal advisors knew what was at stake. The monarchy is not just a family. It is a symbol of continuity. To the public, it represents history, tradition, and national identity. Any suggestion that a senior royal might not be who he claims to be isn't merely gossip. It's a threat to the foundation of the institution. And the ripple effects were already being felt. Parliamentary whispers began about constitutional implications. Conservative MPs reached out quietly to palace liaisons, asking if the DNA rumors could affect Harry's royal status or inheritance. Legal experts began reviewing statutes about succession legitimacy. The Home Office inquired about whether Harry's security clearance, tied to royal classification, might be in jeopardy if he were found not to be a Windsor by blood. Within the palace, aides worked feverishly to prepare contingency plans. If Harry resurfaced, what would be the official line? If he was found alive but had learned something devastating, would the palace acknowledge it? What if he released the DNA results to the public himself? But above all those anxieties loomed one paralyzing question. What if he never came back? This was not a scandal that could be swept under the rug. This was not an affair or a minor breach of protocol. This was the potential unraveling of a royal identity. And the longer Harry remained missing, the more control the palace lost over the narrative. In desperation, some advisors attempted to shape the public dialogue. A few outlets received background briefings suggesting that Harry was taking time for spiritual clarity. Others hinted that he had gone off-grid temporarily due to emotional distress and was being monitored quietly for his own safety. But these narratives failed to hold. People were asking deeper questions. They wanted accountability. They wanted answers. Why did it take Harry initiating the DNA test? Had the palace ever attempted to lay the rumors to rest definitively? Was there a reason the paternity question had been allowed to fester for decades? One particularly troubling theory emerged inside the palace walls, suggesting that someone, years ago, may have deliberately kept the truth from Harry. That Diana's letters, medical records, or private conversations had been buried or withheld. If that were ever proven, the betrayal wouldn't be Harry's for doubting. It would be the monarchy's for concealing. By May 12th, with no new clues about Harry's whereabouts, the palace's fear deepened into quiet hysteria. Emergency meetings were held with PR firms specializing in crisis management. A possible pre-recorded message from Charles was drafted to be released in the event of Harry's confirmed death. Security across royal properties was heightened, not because of external threats, but because no one inside the palace could predict how the public might respond if the worst came to light. And then, a final blow. Late that night, a journalist from a well-respected European publication contacted the palace with a damning piece of information. A source close to James Hewitt claimed Hewitt had, in fact, submitted his own DNA for testing. No details were provided. But if true, it meant Harry may have received results matching Hewitt's profile. And that may have been the moment everything broke. The palace went into absolute lockdown. Charles, who had already retreated from all engagements, reportedly refused to meet with senior staff for 2 days. William, despite his own grief, took the lead on operational continuity. Camilla began liaising with senior clergy and government officials about how to navigate the possibility of a constitutional crisis. And inside the corridors of Buckingham Palace, once filled with structure and certainty, fear was now the dominant currency. Advisors moved like ghosts, briefcases clutched tightly, faces tense. Meetings no longer ended with directives, they ended with silence. Every department was now working independently, trying to fortify itself against the coming storm. But no one could deny the truth anymore. Prince Harry's disappearance was not just a personal tragedy. It was a fracture in the royal institution. And inside the palace, even the most seasoned hands could feel it. The walls that had held secrets for centuries were no longer sound. There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not stem from physical isolation, but from emotional alienation, the feeling that even when surrounded by people, you are fundamentally alone. For Prince Harry, this sensation had haunted him for decades. Born into one of the most scrutinized families in the world, raised under the stifling glare of constant public judgment, Harry had become adept at projecting smiles and composure. But beneath that royal exterior was a young man battling internal wars that few could see, and fewer still truly understood. To fully comprehend Harry's disappearance, one must understand the depths of his psychological journey. This was not a prince who simply ran from the press or escaped palace life in a moment of rebellion. This was a man whose mind had become an emotional battlefield, whose unresolved trauma had reached a critical breaking point, and who, after years of trying to manage his pain through tradition, service, and even love, simply unraveled. His descent didn't begin with the DNA test. That was merely the final trigger. The emotional cracks had been visible long before. In many ways, they began with a moment that still defines him, walking behind the coffin of his mother, Princess Diana, as a 12-year-old boy. That funeral procession, watched by millions around the world, was not only a public act of grief but a psychological crucible. Harry has since admitted in interviews that he was barely present during those days, disassociating from the moment, going numb in the face of a tragedy too large to process. That numbness would become a pattern. In the years that followed, Harry struggled to find an emotional compass. Boarding school at Eton was rigid and lonely. His military service, though a source of pride, also exposed him to the horrors of warfare, further layering trauma onto trauma. His public image oscillated between rogue prince and wounded veteran, but behind the scenes, his mental health was deteriorating. By his late 20s, Harry was reportedly experiencing regular anxiety attacks, nightmares, and periods of emotional withdrawal. Friends said he would vanish for days at a time, refusing to answer calls or messages. At social events, he would oscillate between being overly animated and falling into long silences. One friend described it as watching someone drown in slow motion. He was always smiling above the water, but we all knew something was pulling him under. It wasn't until 2017 that Harry publicly acknowledged his mental health struggles, admitting that he had sought therapy for the first time and had begun to unpack years of suppressed grief and anger. This moment was hailed as a turning point. He became an advocate for mental health awareness, co-founding initiatives like Heads Together and later the Apple TV Plus series on mental health with Oprah Winfrey. But public advocacy doesn't equate to personal healing. Privately, Harry was still battling a deep sense of dislocation, feeling torn between the expectations of his royal identity and the emotional reality of who he was. He often said, according to close friends, that he felt like a man trapped in a suit stitched by other people. Then came Meghan. Their relationship, to many, appeared as a lifeline. Meghan represented freedom, empathy, and a worldview unshaped by aristocratic tradition. In their earliest public appearances, Harry seemed lighter, more grounded. He smiled more easily. He engaged with causes not just out of duty, but with genuine passion. But the couple's happiness quickly collided with the brutal machinery of the British press, and, some say, the cold formality of the royal institution. As negative headlines piled up, ranging from critiques of Meghan's wardrobe to questions about their parenting, the couple began to withdraw. By 2020, they announced their departure from royal duties, citing the unbearable toll on their mental health and well-being. Their move to California, while seen as betrayal by some, was described by Harry as a necessary act of survival. But relocation did not equal resolution. In interviews from Montecito, Harry spoke candidly about panic attacks, triggers, and the trauma of losing his mother. He described Meghan's suicidal ideation during their time in the UK and how powerless he felt to protect her. He blamed the press. He blamed the palace. But what he rarely said out loud, what insiders believe was too painful to articulate, was that he also blamed himself. One therapist close to Harry, speaking anonymously, explained that Harry was carrying a form of compound guilt, a mental condition in which a person feels responsible for the pain and misfortune of everyone around them. He felt guilt over his mother's death, guilt over abandoning the military, guilt over leaving the royal family, guilt over the strain placed on his relationship with William, and more recently, a gnawing guilt over the possibility that he had spent his entire life building an identity on a lie. That lie, of course, was the question of his paternity. When Harry began seriously investigating the rumors surrounding James Hewitt, those close to him noticed a sharp change in behavior. He became quieter, more internal. He canceled meetings. He took long walks alone. He stopped returning texts from friends. Meghan, according to one staffer, begged him to drop it, fearing that the emotional fallout could be irreversible. But Harry was adamant. "I have to know," he reportedly said. "Even if it breaks everything. I have to know." The weight of that statement cannot be overstated. For a man already teetering on the edge, the possibility that his entire life narrative was built on falsehood threatened to push him into psychological freefall. Those who saw him in the weeks before his disappearance describe a man grappling with unbearable inner conflict. One friend said Harry looked like a man being eaten from the inside out. His eyes were hollow. His voice had no center. Mental health experts consulted by investigators described this state as identity destabilization, a condition in which the foundational truths a person believes about themselves are suddenly shaken, causing a cascade of emotional and cognitive disorientation. It's not just confusion. It's not just sadness. It's a full-scale collapse of self. And in Harry's case, the collapse was compounded by public scrutiny, royal expectation, and the lingering trauma of unresolved grief. His decision to request a DNA test and potentially follow through with receiving results was not just a search for answers. It was a psychological Hail Mary, a last-ditch effort to find stable ground in a life that had never truly felt his own. When he vanished, many assumed it was a calculated move, perhaps a security measure, perhaps a publicity stunt. But those closest to him believed something far darker occurred. That Harry, upon receiving or fearing the results, fell into an emotional spiral so deep that he chose silence over confrontation, not out of selfishness, not out of spite, but out of psychological necessity. He had reached a point where no conversation, no therapy, no public address could patch the hole in his soul. He needed space not to be found, but to be nobody for a while, to escape the name, the title, the crown, and even the family he had so long fought to both defend and escape. And this wasn't the first time he'd felt this pull. Sources close to Harry say he had often fantasized about vanishing. Not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet one. Disappearing into a village in Africa or a cabin in Canada. He spoke of finding silence and walking away without a trace. At the time, his comments were treated as poetic expressions of stress. Now, they read like premonitions. The psychological toll of living a life as simultaneously public and uncertain as Harry's is difficult to quantify. But those who understand trauma recognize the signs, the disconnection, the need for reinvention, the craving for escape. Add to that the emotional volatility of paternity doubts, and the situation becomes not just complex, but potentially dangerous. The most heartbreaking detail emerged from a note Harry left behind. Not a suicide note, not a manifesto. Just a small, handwritten line scribbled on hotel stationery in Santa Barbara, now preserved by authorities. It read, "I'm not sure I was ever meant to be here." That sentence speaks volumes. Not because it suggests self-harm, but because it articulates the root of Harry's mental health struggle, a lifelong feeling of misplacement, of being a player in a play he didn't audition for, saying lines he didn't write. Harry didn't disappear because he hated his family. He didn't disappear because he wanted revenge. He disappeared because he no longer recognized the man in the mirror, and the cost of staying visible had become too much. The tragedy of mental health is that, for many, it remains invisible until the final moment. Friends see the smile, not the breakdown. Family hears the jokes, not the silence that follows. For Harry, that invisibility became a weapon. It allowed him to hide his pain in plain sight. And now, with his absence stretching into weeks, the hope of recovery becomes harder to grasp. Still, those who love him hold on. To memories, to his laughter, to the possibility that somewhere, in a quiet place far from the cameras, Prince Harry is trying, painfully, quietly, to rebuild himself from scratch. Not as a royal, not as a symbol, but as a man. In every great unraveling, there's a figure who becomes the subject of conflicting narratives, hero to some, villain to others. In the case of Prince Harry's disappearance, that figure is Meghan Markle. From the moment she entered the royal stage, Meghan was hailed by her supporters as a breath of fresh air, an independent woman who infused a centuries-old institution with modernity and empathy. Her detractors, however, viewed her as a disruptor, someone unwilling to play by the rules, whose presence introduced friction into an already delicate family dynamic. Now, in the wake of Harry's vanishing and the emotional chaos gripping the monarchy, the question that looms over her involvement is impossible to ignore. Was Meghan trying to shield her husband from a breakdown, or had her influence, intentionally or not, deepened the cracks that led to his disappearance? To even attempt to answer that question, one must first understand the complicated psychology of their relationship. From the outside, Harry and Meghan's connection appeared nothing short of cinematic. A whirlwind romance, two people from vastly different worlds drawn together by shared values and a desire to escape the rigid expectations placed upon them. But from the inside, their union was shaped by far more than love. It was a collision of trauma, ambition, and the desperate need for emotional refuge. Harry, long burdened by unresolved grief and years of suppressing emotional vulnerability, found in Meghan what he had lacked in the royal institution. Someone who saw him not as a prince or spare heir, but as a person. Meghan, in turn, brought her own scars to the relationship, experiences with racism, media hostility, and a strained relationship with elements of her own family. Together, they formed a bond that was as protective as it was intense. But intensity can be a double-edged sword. In private, their relationship was described by some insiders as sealed off, with Harry becoming increasingly insulated from old friends, former confidants, and even members of his own family. While Meghan was often framed as the cause of that isolation, others believe she simply responded to the hostility she encountered within the palace walls. From the moment she joined the royal family, Meghan was met with passive aggression cloaked in tradition, questions about her background, whispered criticisms of her assertiveness, and press briefings from palace insiders that undermined her public image. Harry, sensitive to injustice and still traumatized by the way his mother had been treated, reportedly became fiercely protective. He cut off several royal aides, clashed with senior staff, and even distanced himself from William, who allegedly expressed concerns about the speed of his relationship with Meghan. This protective posture, while born out of love, also signaled the beginning of a wedge, one that would eventually drive Harry out of the institution entirely.